years. I'll begin with some quotes. Here's one from Governor Greg Abbott from 2015. The values that Christ teaches were the values and principles on which this nation was founded. From Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, but back when he was a state senator, the values that we are a Judeo-Christian nation, primarily a Christian nation, and there is no such thing as separation of church and state. And then a couple of quotes here from Robert Jeffress, a First Baptist Dallas pastor, Fox News contributor, and Trump advisor from 2016, a book that he wrote in 2016. The fact that our Constitution demands that everyone have the freedom to embrace any religious belief or no religious beliefs does not mean that the government cannot demonstrate a preference for Christianity over other religions. And he also says the framers of the Constitution did not hesitate to declare that America was a Christian nation. The First Amendment does not even require that the government treat all faiths equally. Well, statements like these should sound pretty familiar after what we've heard from Catherine, Andrew, and Sam. What I'd like to point out is that these are all quotes from Texans, prominent Texans. And that points to the fact that the Lone Star State is a hotbed of Christian nationalism, the home of some of its major proponents. But how has Christian nationalism actually shaped the political landscape here in Texas? That's the question that I've set out to answer in my ongoing research project. This spring, the Baker Institute published my report on the first phase of that research under what I admit is not a very sexy title, Christian Americanism and Texas Politics Since 2008. Christian Americanism, by the way, is synonymous with Christian nationalism. I personally prefer Christian Americanism, but I'll use Christian nationalism here in this presentation to avoid confusion. The report does not focus on critiquing Christian nationalism itself. I'm skeptical of Christian nationalists' historical claims, but I'll leave that to the academic historians. I also take issue with Christian nationalists' belief that Christianity, typically in a conservative evangelical form, should dictate law and public policy. However, that's an argument for another time and place. The point of this report, this Baker Institute report, is not critical, but descriptive. And since the report runs to nearly 90 pages, I'm unable to cover it in detail here. Instead, I'll talk about what led me to undertake this study, what I found, and what's next. I've been studying and writing about Christian nationalism for several years. Initially, I focused on how it has influenced Texas public education, and specifically the controversial overhaul of the Texas public school social studies curriculum standards in 2010. And some of that research can be found in my very first Baker Institute report, Religious Imbalance in the Texas Social Studies Curriculum, another sexy title, published in October 2016, and it's still available on the Institute's website if you want to take a look at it. I've also written for several publications, including Texas Observer and Religion Dispatches, about Christian nationalist influence on Texas politics more broadly. In the course of this work, I found that though there is a growing literature on the ideology nationally, and my fellow panelists' works are outstanding examples, comparatively little systematic scholarship has focused on Christian nationalism in Texas politics. My ongoing research project seeks to fill that gap. The first step was to map the territory of Christian nationalism in Texas, to identify the main proponents, both in and out of government, and the means they use to promote the ideology. And the Baker Institute generously funded this initial step of my project. This first descriptive study serves as a springboard for more analytical investigation, which is the next phase of my research. At present, for instance, I'm analyzing the response of prominent Texas Christian nationalists to the COVID-19 pandemic, and more on that later. All right, mapping the territory breaks into three parts. Who are the major proponents of Christian nationalism in Texas? What means do they use to promote it? And what further research is necessary? So, major proponents. Just as the rise of the religious right in the 1980s and 1990s cannot be understood without reference to movement leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, Christian nationalism cannot be understood as a force in Texas politics apart from the religious and political figures who promote it, frame the movement's message and goals, and inspire and motivate their followers. The first part of the report offers a who's who of Christian nationalism in Texas since 2008. I profile 6 prominent and influential lawmakers and 12 non-governmental Christian nationalists, including political activists, ministers, and major donors. The profiles indicate the degree to which each figure appears to embrace the ideology and the type of influence each exerts. Among the lawmakers profiled are some familiar names in Texas politics: Senator Ted Cruz, Congressman Louis Gohmert, former Governor Rick Perry, current Governor Greg Abbott, and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. The non-governmental activists profiled are amateur historian David Barton, author and media personality Glenn Beck, self-described political operative David Lane, doctor and activist Steve Hotze, economist Gary North, oil and gas developer Tim Dunn, billionaires Dan and Ferris Wilks, and pastors Rafael Cruz, Robert Jeffress, Dave Welch, and John Hagee. And that brings us then to the second question. What means do these Christian nationalist lawmakers and activists use to promote the ideology? And I found a wide range, some of which I had only been dimly aware of when I set out on this project. Not only books and other publications and mass media outlets, but also nonprofit organizations, PACs and super PACs, social media, churches, other religio-political gatherings, and of course, legislation. The last of these, legislation, offers an interesting surprise that demands further investigation, as I'll discuss momentarily. Like many public figures these days, several of our state's Christian nationalists regularly take to social media to spread their message, and they've gained quite an audience. For instance, as of February of this year, David Barton's Facebook site had nearly 180,000 follows. First Baptist Dallas pastor Robert Jeffress, also active on social media, had over 217,000 Facebook followers as of February 2020. And in 2019, last year, Jeffress posted an image of the Statue of Liberty emblazoned with the quote, "Our country was founded as a Christian nation." The post had received over 2,800 likes by the following day. Another means, nonprofits and super PACs that promote Christian nationalist ideas and activities. Here are 2 examples, both involving conservative Christian billionaires Dan and Ferris Wilks, residents of Cisco, Texas, known as the Koch brothers of the Christian right. First, Dan Wilks' nonprofit Heavenly Fathers Foundation has helped to fund David Lane's Pastors and Pews efforts, which offer free lodging and meals for pastors and their spouses, enabling them to hear messages from Christian nationalists such as Rick Perry, Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, Rafael Cruz, and David Barton. Second, Ferris Wilks and members of his family reportedly gave $15 million to the Keep the Promise super PAC, headed by David Barton, that backed Senator Cruz's ultimately unsuccessful presidential bid. Now, findings. Perhaps the most significant finding of the report offers something of a puzzle. It involves legislation, or more precisely, the lack thereof. Given the core Christian nationalist claim that the founders intended that Christianity would shape U.S. law and public policy, and that it should do so today, one might reasonably expect to see sympathetic legislators introduce bills giving preferential treatment to Christianity or the Judeo-Christian heritage. However, few measures explicitly favoring Christianity have been filed in the Texas legislature over the past decade. Instead, sympathetic legislators have filed myriad bills that, though not explicitly pro-Christian, would arguably advance the Christian nationalist agenda. These include measures requiring biblical instruction in public schools and allowing school prayer or carving out religious liberty exemptions. These bills are couched, however, in terms of protecting religion generally rather than privileging Christianity explicitly. For instance, shielding persons who act according to sincerely held religious beliefs. So why the apparent disconnect between, on the one hand, Christian nationalist public comments asserting the nation's essentially Christian character and calling for promotion of Christian values, and on the other hand, the rarity of legislation expressly privileging Christian belief and practice? Answering this question could get at the function of Christian nationalism in Texas politics. For instance, does it function primarily as a legislative agenda, or does its main function lie elsewhere? The report identifies three explanatory hypotheses that merit further testing. They are not mutually exclusive. The first hypothesis: in order to shield pro-Christian legislation from court challenges, Christian nationalist lawmakers avoid using explicitly Christian language in legislation or using Christian beliefs to justify the legislation they support. Instead, the task of connecting legislation with conservative Christian beliefs is left to Christian nationalist activists outside government. Hypothesis 2: Christian nationalists are playing the long game, taking an incremental approach to breaking down church-state separation and privileging conservative Christianity. For example, legislation promoting school prayer or legally shielding those who discriminate on religious grounds, even without explicitly pro-Christian language or elements, sets legal precedents that could pave the way for more explicitly Christian preferential legislation in future. Catherine mentioned Project Blitz earlier, and the Project Blitz legislative playbook for 2018-2019, in which David Barton was involved, suggests that something of the sort may be at work. Discussing a model bill that would require "In God We Trust" to be prominently displayed in government buildings, the playbook's authors note that, quote, even if it does not become law, it can still provide the basis to shore up later support for other governmental entities to support religious displays, end quote. Now, hypothesis 3 is a bit more wonky than the others, but may be the most persuasive. This hypothesis suggests that Christian nationalism functions in Texas politics primarily as a symbolic boundary, and only secondarily as a political program or a legislative agenda. Symbolic boundaries create in-groups and out-groups to draw lines between those who are welcome and those who are not welcome. They separate us from them. According to this hypothesis, then, Christian nationalist rhetoric defines who is a real American and who is not, whose voices count in political discourse, and whose values deserve to be enacted in law and public policy. And by the way, Andrew and Sam make similar observations in Taking America Back for God. When politicians use Christian nationalist rhetoric, they are identifying themselves as one of us, people like us, as Sam put it earlier, defenders of the nation's alleged Christian essence, rather than one of them, separationists, secularists, non-Christians, etc. And they also affirm and reinforce conservative Christians' own sense of identity and moral superiority. If this hypothesis 3 bears out, then the apparent lack of legislative follow-through does not mean that Christian nationalism is ineffective or politically insignificant. Rather, Christian nationalist rhetoric is, in a sense, an end in itself, alongside the goal of implementing legislation and policy that furthers the Christian nationalist agenda. So, what's next? As I mentioned earlier, I've been tracking how the Christian nationalists profiled in Christian Americanism and Texas politics have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic this year. Among other things, Governor Abbott, the highest-ranking Christian nationalist in state government, has faced an open revolt from his fellow Christian nationalists, such as Steve Hotze and State Senator Bob Hall, over lockdowns and the statewide mask mandate. Yet the intensity of that revolt, and it's been pretty intense with the word tyranny being thrown around, monarchy and so on, tends to conceal the fact that the governor actually has far more in common with his opponents than it may appear on the surface. And I hope that this study will be available from the Baker Institute later this year. And if we're able to return to some semblance of normal post-COVID, Christian nationalism is likely to remain a potent force in Texas politics for some time to come, and thus should give my fellow panelists and me plenty to study. So thank you.